I felt so bad for taking such a long break in between my two previous episodes, so to make up for it, this time I'm sort of gonna zoom in and just focus on the things I've been working on these past 2 weeks, but it's still gonna be fun, so please grab a drink, grab your knitting or crafting project, and let's get started. And once again, if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing so you don't miss my future episodes. So let's start with my first finished object, and I have so many thoughts and so many things to say about this one, and I've already talked about it in detail in my last podcast, and this is of course my dot top, which is now finally finished. But I guess I shouldn't say finally because it didn't really take me that long to knit this, but the process has been really frustrating, especially at the beginning, and in good faith, I can't really recommend this pattern. I guess I should also preface this section by using an iconic phrase from Elsa from We Are Wool People, which is, patterns are not sentient beings. So even though sometimes I feel like it's really kind of harsh to say anything negative about the pattern because, of course, this is a creative endeavor and the person behind it has probably poured their soul into it. I don't have anything good to say about this pattern besides the fact that I like this design. And of course, illusion knitting, shadow knitting is really cool and really unique, but I did not enjoy making this. I have already talked about how I don't like the sizing here, and the designer actually confirmed in one of the question and answers on the Ravelry comment page that it was basically done this way to accommodate for the repeats, which is exactly what I said in my video. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but combined with the fact that the pattern asks for a gauge that doesn't really correspond with the stitch pattern you're knitting in, it's just a lot of guesswork, and it's really hard to choose your size and understand where exactly you fall in the size range. It just wasn't fun for me to invest my time into this project, not really knowing what it would look like until it's finished, because of course you can't try it on because it's knit side to side, so I was just praying that it would fit me and it won't come out too small. But considering all this, I still like how this finished object looks on me, but when I was still first planning to knit this, I envisioned my version to have more positive ease and to be this flowy tank top, but instead it's much more fitting than I would have liked. With this pattern, you're in for row by row instructions, and it's not something you can knit mindlessly or look away from or knit casually. You need to know where you are in the pattern at all times. It does have these helpful colorful dots to mark each section, but because every row is really similar, it just kind of blurs into this one block of text, and if you're lost, it's really hard to understand where you are, and you can't really knit this intuitively as, for example, color work or lace, because you're shaping the dots on the wrong side and you have to be constantly turning your work back and forth to check if you're doing it correctly in case you are lost. At this point, I will just die on this hill, but this pattern really needed a nice chart you can follow, not just for reference, and I've said it a million times already, but I really do believe that. Another thing that really bugged me about the dot top was the typos and mistakes I encountered while knitting this, and of course my hope is that it will be fixed in updates, sort of eventually it will sort itself out, but I'm not even sure how this could happen given the number of testers for this design. In my case, I ended up with a permanently incorrect row under one of my armholes, and thankfully it is under the armhole, so you can't really see it, but if it was, for example, somewhere in the middle of the front, it would have been really distracting. I didn't catch it at the time because I was just following this pattern, and I thought that one of my rows on the wrong side looked weird, but I didn't think anything of it until I was actually blocking the top, and this is what the update was for. So the update I mentioned in the last video, which didn't have any explanation or overview about what was changed, turns out that this was the update that fixed that specific row, but I just didn't know and I was already past it. I'm fully aware that some of my complaints are really minute and personal and don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but this was my experience with a paid pattern that I have paid for, and I have invested a lot of my time and concentration into knitting this. I also have a feeling that some of the complaints from knitters who have either knit this top or were trying to make it will not really be taken into consideration, because I see the designer working on the dot jumper already, and it's almost in testing, or it is in testing currently. I wanted to save my thoughts on test knitting for this next section, because I will be talking about a test knit I recently finished, but I guess I can talk about it now. So first of all, I don't participate in test knits. Usually this is going to be the exception, but I just don't find them to be worth my time, because I am a chronic modifier, so I can't really, or like I don't find the joy in following a pattern to a T, which is usually what the designer wants when you're test knitting for them. And all of my previous attempts at test knitting were kind of jinxed, because of course the designer is asking you for a specific time frame to knit a project in, but as soon as I agree to a test knit, I get really sick and I get into this dog ate my homework situation, which is really embarrassing, and I don't want to be somebody who is like unreliable or like pulls out of a test knit. So I just wait for a pattern to come out. I don't really see the point in me like having the pattern early, and I would rather somebody who enjoys test knitting do it for me, sort of. Secondly, I have an unpopular opinion for you, although I don't think it's actually that unpopular, but I feel like often it's just done for the social media marketing aspect and just to fill somebody's feed with different versions and pictures of a specific pattern that has recently came out or is just going to be released soon and you can't miss. Of course, it's much more appealing for a newly released pattern to already have an established Ravelry page with multiple projects and like different versions you can choose from, and it's not everybody's cup of tea to be this like first person to ever knit a pattern without any reference besides the pattern pictures. But in terms of actually improving a pattern before it's released, I don't think that test knitting does a good job of that sometimes. And when it comes to test knits from larger designers or like super popular designers for which it's really hard to get selected for, I feel like knitters are not really inclined to share their feedback, especially if it's negative, because it's this parasocial relationship aspect. They might be afraid that if they voice some complaints or like some problems with the pattern, they would just not be chosen again. And a lot of questions that test knitting usually claims to address can be easily resolved by just good tech editing. And there's this whole other issue regarding lack of like compensation for test knitters and tight deadlines, which I'm not gonna get into because I don't have a lot of experience test knitting. Oh, and also this parasocial relationship aspect of it kind of goes both ways in my opinion, because sometimes the designer might not be inclined to tell their test knitters that they're doing something wrong, or the project is not coming out right, or their tension is bad, or maybe their skills are not there yet to test this specific pattern. It's completely understandable and normal to not want to upset people who are investing their time into something that is more beneficial to you as a designer who will probably make money from this pattern. I'd be really curious to know your opinion as well, so please let me know in the comments, especially if you're a designer or somebody who test knits a lot. And I know that some of you might not agree with me, and I'm actually really excited to hear from you specifically if you don't agree with me, and I hope that we can have this like discussion in the comments. So there are a couple more things I'd like to say about the dot top before we move on, and firstly, I have modified the neckline and armholes. So right from the beginning, I knew that I didn't want to add the I-cord. I felt like just this raw edge looked much neater, and when I first saw how much negative ease it has on me, I also noticed that my just armhole depth, or like not depth, but like armhole curve is not what I wanted, and it gives me this like chicken wing situation, which is not something I really want to have. It just makes my arms look like bigger and my shoulders look rounder than they are. And my preference when it comes to sleeveless tops is to have this line be kind of as vertical and as straight as possible. So since I still didn't want to add the I-cord, I decided to just add this like stockinette rolled edge to sort of help this fabric stretch out here at the chest. It took me some trial and error to get this right in terms of the stitch count and the needle size I needed to use, because I at first kind of forgot that I really sized down my needles for this top, because usually when I knit in Sandnes Garn Line, I use either 3.75 or 4 millimeters, but I was knitting this on 3 millimeters. And my first attempt was super off. I tried to knit the stockinette edge on the neckline on 2.5 millimeter needles, and I couldn't get my head through it. I tried to do it again on 3 millimeters with a stretchy bind off, but it didn't help. So then it dawned on me that I need to kind of go against my own logic and increase the needle size compared to what I was using for the body. So once again with this project, third time was the charm, and I went with 3.75 millimeters, which worked out beautifully. And I think that this edge really brings the top together and gives it enough extra height on the neckline and extra width at the armholes, and kind of stretches the fabric here that it kind of covers my armpits area the way I usually like. My favorite way to style this was with a maxi satin black skirt, and I feel like it plays with the sportiness of this top really well, but I have to report that unfortunately it's too warm for a heat wave. This stitch pattern is quite heavy, so it was just way too warm for me to wear in a 40-degree weather. It is a shame because it's knit in Line, which is a very nice, breathable, cool summer yarn, but this fabric just has too much texture going on. And although I won't knit this top in the future, since I have some yarn left over, I feel like I might come back to this specific stitch pattern for something like a little pouch or maybe a pillowcase. And moving on to my next finished object, this was, as I said, a test knit for my friend Ieva, and it's going to be her first design called the Amelle Scarf. You probably well know by now that I am a sucker for small scarves, and there can never be enough for me. So when she asked me if I wanted to test knit her design, I said yes. Even though you know my thoughts on test knitting, I just had to make an exception for my friend. Ieva is a fantastically talented knitter, and she has such a good eye for color and color combos, so I'm just always inspired by what she is currently making. And she also has a clothing brand called 314, which incidentally makes amazing project bags, and she has gifted me 2 last year, and I've been using them all the time. This is my favorite. I just keep a sweater project in here, but I also sometimes just wear it as a regular bag. I'm not paid or sponsored by her in any way, and I only have a discount code, but it's not even an affiliate code. It's just something for you in case you want to try one of these bags, which I do really recommend. And one other reason that I have agreed to test knit for her is that I had a perfect combo of yarns in my stash sort of put aside for a small scarf down the line. So since the opportunity presented itself, I just used it for this test, and I'm in love with this yarn combo. I usually avoid adding mohair when I'm knitting small scarves because some of my coats or like winter jackets are super clingy, so if I wear something with fluff on it, I will just have this fluff kind of like stuck to the fabric of the coat, and I would much rather go for something smooth. But since I basically couldn't figure out what else I could use these yarns for, I decided to try it, and it's such a game changer. I just love how fluffy this is. This is Knitting for Olive Merino in the shade Midnight, held together with Isager Silk Mohair in the shade Slate, and they are slightly different, and this silk mohair has a lovely like bright silver strand, but I feel like this texture shows up really well, and it gives it this like playful marling effect, but it's super subtle. This is actually the right side of the scarf, so it's knit in this like broken rib motif, but the wrong side was very familiar to me because it's basically the same stitch pattern that I used for the accursed heather sweater that I knit last year for my boyfriend. I just remembered the stitch pattern immediately, and knitting this was such a breeze. I've actually timed myself just for fun, and it took me 6.5 hours to knit this whole scarf, which is really quick in my opinion, because usually when it comes to knitting it's like 10 hours or more, but this was really fun, really pleasant. And with this scarf being Ieva's first ever pattern, I feel like it's quite well written, and I only had one tiny note throughout this whole testing process, but everything else was great and I didn't have any hiccups. So even with this knit, I could not stop myself from modifying at least something, but I feel like it was warranted because this pattern will recommend 2 balls of Cardiff Cashmere Classic, which have about 200 meters combined, but I had this really incomplete ball of Isager silk mohair and I had less than 20 grams, which meant that I definitely didn't have 200 meters. So to make up for it, I skipped 2 repeats, so like 2 ridges here in the center, and otherwise my scarf is exactly per pattern, although it's of course a couple of centimeters smaller. And this was again really easy to knit. The I-cord is integrated here, you don't have to add anything afterwards, and it's not a Sophie scarf situation, so you can see exactly where you need to increase, and it's quite repetitive in this sense, so you can't really get lost or make a mistake here. So at the time of me recording this pattern has not actually come out yet, but it's planning to be released either at the end of August or in the beginning of September, so please check it out when it does get released. And my biggest surprise with this knit is just how much I love a fluffy fabric on a small scarf, and I tried to, as I said, go for something smoother before, but this halo is just incredible. And of course, Isager silk mohair is a bit fluffier compared to Knitting for Olive soft silk mohair, so I feel like these 2 yarns are a really nice option for this almost Angora-like effect. It's also incredibly lightweight and I don't find it to be itchy against the skin, but of course I'll see more once I start wearing this later in the fall. So the next project I want to talk about is weirdly in between a finished object and still a work in progress, and this is the Hope Top, which I have finished knitting last week, but I wore it once and realized that I have made such a rookie mistake that feels almost silly to talk about, but I would have to go back and fix it. But before I get into it, I want to get the good things out of the way. So firstly, I really love this yarn. This is Pascuali Pinta, which was sent to me by the brand. I'm really impressed with it. I really loved knitting with it, and it has a beautiful drape and luster because of the silk in the blend. And another thing I really like about this top is the color and also of course how it fits me. I feel like this type of armhole and neckline is really flattering on me, and in general I highly recommend the Hope Top pattern. It's super well written, the instructions are clear, concise, and the cable edge might look complicated, but it's integrated into the knitting process. You don't have to add it separately, and it's really easy to get into the rhythm of doing these cables before you just switch to knitting in stockinette. So besides what I'm about to tell you, this is a 10 out of 10 banger project. I would definitely reach for it next summer all the time, unless I lose it like I did my plain yoke tee, but I wore it once, and when I was wearing it, it was riding up really weirdly on my waist, and I couldn't figure out why, but then it dawned on me that I made this really simple mistake that in hindsight seems again really dumb and kind of even silly to bring up. So, as I discussed last time, the only modification I made to this top was to kind of slightly taper the body towards the waist, and of course, if you're doing that, you also need to flare it back out towards the hips, which is something I didn't do. So I couldn't understand what the issue was and like what I did wrong, because the bind off that I went for was not too tight and also the length was great. So I was just really confused until I realized that, you know, a human body has an hourglass shape, and I just didn't follow that and instead kind of like cinched in my hips. And thankfully, I do have some yarn left over, so about 20 grams. So I just need to unpick my bind off and go back to like the waist section and just reknit it again. But I'm really not looking forward to that, because when you move something from your whip pile to your wardrobe, it's really hard to get it back out and it feels really discouraging. But I'm mostly kind of laughing at myself for forgetting such like an essential thing about, you know, garment construction, and I know I can just fix it and it's gonna look great, but I'll keep it in mind for the future. But one last thing I want to add now about this project is that in the end, I decided not to fuss with a cabled ribbing or an I-cord or anything else intricate at the hem, and I just went for this simple short ribbing and curled stockinette combo, similar to something like a cloud sweater. And even though this specific ribbing is gonna get frogged, I think I will just replicate it once I'm happy with the new width at the hips. So just as last time, I want to start discussing my works in progress, starting with the one that is closest to being finished, and in this case, it's this emotional support pigeon. I think we can all agree that this is indeed a pigeon, and no matter how you squint and like try to pretend that this is a chicken, it's just not gonna happen because this color scheme is really pigeony, even though it's not really what I intended when I started this project. Considering how massively popular this pattern is, it's just really surprising that I haven't made one before, but I'm glad I finally got around to making this, and I'm also really curious to know how many of you have knit the emotional support chicken, and I think I'm going to use the quiz feature here on YouTube to make a little quiz and see if the numbers I have in my head actually correspond with like the reality. And there were a couple of reasons why I decided to cast this on, and one of them was, of course, that over the years I have accumulated so many scraps of mohairs and like different really weird fingering weight yarns. I didn't really throw them away. I tried to keep some of them for mending purposes, and others I've just saved for the botanica flowers. But most of my small leftover quantities of mohair are either dark gray or light gray or somewhere in between, so not super suitable for flowers. And when I was browsing through the emotional support chicken projects on Ravelry, I noticed that the ones I'm drawn to the most have some kind of mohair or fluff or like fuzziness to them, and I don't really like the ones that are made out of smooth, for example, sock yarn or like weird variegated yarn or superwash merino. And the other reason I finally decided to make this is that I saw a very specific version of this pattern by one of the Ravelry users, and they specifically made the silky chicken, which is adorable, and I really wanted to recreate it. But considering that I ended up making a pigeon accidentally, I don't think I even need to waste the mohair to do this like fluffy comb at the top, and instead I'm just gonna leave it as it is and embrace the pigeonness. This was very enjoyable to knit, and I used so many scraps in this that I'm just like really happy that I got some sort of housekeeping done in my stash, and now I just have less little quantities to worry about. And although the light colored section of this bird looks really kind of scrappy and variegated, all of these variations in color were really intentionally placed, and I tried to kind of balance out the speckles and different colored stripes, and I think I was quite successful at that. I really love this effect, and basically this yarn combo involves holding Knitting for Olive Merino in the shade Pearl Grey together with two different mohairs. The one I was holding together with it throughout was Lanagatos silk mohair in bright white, and the second strand of mohair was the one I was constantly rotating through in terms of colors. And for the gray contrast stripes that kind of derailed this project into being a pigeon knit, I used Knitting for Olive Merino in the shade Rainy Day and some just random dark mohairs that I had in stash. And these pink stripes here are actually Torino from La Mana. It's a really thin boucle yarn, and I just added some for fun to kind of add a more defined speckle of color. This was knit exactly per pattern, but I did make a tiny mistake, so I kind of misunderstood the instructions and thought that the two sides of the tail are supposed to be sewn together here on the wrong side, but instead it was supposed to be on the right side with contrasting yarn to kind of have this like fun top to the tail, and I didn't do that, so I think I'm just gonna take this dark yarn, which I have a little scrap of, and just add a ridge with a crochet hook. But otherwise, I followed the pattern exactly, and in this case, it's really fun to actually follow these row by row instructions. You have these like sections to knitting, and you're constantly doing wraps and turns and like German short rows, so you're always engaged and really want to get to the next section. Also, because I was constantly changing colors and like seeing my scraps kind of disappear in real time, it made it even more fun for me because I knew that like the more I work on this project, the less like leftover yarns I will have left, and the more I could see how my stripes open up. The pattern doesn't tell you to block the pieces, but I have blocked my bird because I really wanted the mohair to open up and like fluff up even more with blocking, and I wanted to also kind of even out my stitches. And if you are familiar with this pattern, you know that there's one more piece to knitting this. There is a separate like breast panel that you attach separately, and I have knitted, but it's in one of my project bags and I can't really locate it now, but I hope I do before I have to seam it up because I don't have any knitting for olive left over to complete this. And for the yellow beak, I have used Rosarios Alvor in this beautiful wheat yellow shade, and it doesn't have a name, but it's the shade number 13. And all that's left to do now is to just attach the eyes, but I think I'm just gonna use a dot of black yarn instead of like a button or an actual like set of eyes for a toy. And then I need to fill it with hollow fiber and seam it up, but I think I'm gonna do the same thing as for my sheep and add some lavender to it, because as I talked last time, this is my kind of migraine relief toy and I've been really loving it. It's been so helpful. So I might actually buy more dry lavender to like really fill it up with it and have this pigeon be really useful to me. And if you know me personally, you can expect me to knit you an emotional support chicken unprompted without like any reason. You'll get one for Christmas, for your birthday, for just a Friday or whatever, because they're so fun to knit, and exactly as the pattern says, they're incredibly addictive. So I'm slowly transitioning into fall knitting, but not too quickly because I do want to enjoy the summer while it still lasts. But the project I've been kind of heavily working on last week, and I'm planning to finish as soon as possible so I can have it ready for when the weather eventually gets a lot cooler, is my Obsidian Blouse. And I love how it's coming out so far. I showed it last time and raved about this project already, but now it's much closer to being done. What's interesting about this is that usually my process of knitting sweaters, which are usually top down anyway, is to knit the section at the top and then separate for body and sleeves and basically knit the body until I'm done with whatever ball of yarn I'm knitting this in, and then get to knitting the sleeves. And I usually finish one of the sleeves, get back to the body, and kind of finish it off with another sleeve. But here I actually finished the full body before even starting on the sleeves, and it's mostly because I really wanted to see how it would look and like wanted to decide on the hem. And in the end, I stuck with the original pattern suggestion and did this folded stockinette hem. And although it's curling now, I think it's going to be better once it's blocked and it's going to kind of fall into place and be flat, because usually my only problem with hems like these is that they tend to still curl up and like reverse themselves even after blocking. But I think that this yarn is sort of pliable enough to hold in place. And although I'm having a lot of fun with this knit and all of the complicated parts are done because I have knit the double knit edge on the keyhole opening and added the I-cord and the ties, but I have two small hiccups when it comes to knitting this. The first little hiccup is that I don't think I'll have enough of the mohair, or like the cashmere fluff, to finish this. I started with 5 25-gram balls of this yarn, and it is thicker than silk mohair, so I think it has 175 meters in one ball, and I assumed that it will be enough, but now I don't think it will be because I'm on my last ball of yarn and I'm only in the middle of the first sleeve. These sleeves are pretty wide, so it's not like my circumference or stitch count will be smaller by the time I'm at the cuff. So I think I need to just get to my local yarn store and buy one extra ball. And I'm afraid that I'm not gonna have the same dye lot, so I hope I won't have to do any like alternating or marling to make it work. And since I got back from Sweden, I'm trying really hard to only work from stash and like come up with some stash busting ideas or really work through what I have before I even think about buying new yarn. It just feels a tiny bit painful to have to go and buy more yarn and add it to my stash, even if it's just 25 grams. This is actually not the biggest issue with this knit because my biggest concern with this is the fact that my tension has definitely changed since I joined in the round. And I'm assuming that's just a given with this yarn combo because I'm holding this fluffy yarn with a strand of Trio 1 from Isager, and it's really thin, really kind of, I don't know, not structured, but like really dense and not at all stretchy or like forgiving. So I feel like it wraps around the yarn too much when I'm knitting in the round, and the stitches themselves are much more smooth and the fluff is kind of hidden. And when I was knitting flat, it kind of evened out because I was turning my rows, but here I'm just wrapping it in the same direction all the time. And I used 3.75 to knit this flat, and once I got to knitting in the round, I saw how different the fabric became, so I frogged back and switched to 4 millimeters for knitting in the round, and I think it helped. But you know, when I was editing my last podcast and I saw myself showing this knit, I immediately noticed this line and I was like, ooh, it looks horrible. I think I even like cut out a part where I was like, oh, you can't even see the difference between, you know, me knitting flat and knitting in the round now. Now I know that you sure can see the difference, but I'm hoping that it's only something a knitter would notice, and with blocking it might get back to normal. And this is why, even though I love this yarn combo in theory, I don't think I would use it again unless it's for a very specific project that has me knitting flat the whole time. I've actually had a similar situation before that kind of became a deal breaker, and I completely frogged the project, and it involved slip stitch fabric. So you knit one stitch and the other stitch you slip on every right side row. So while I was knitting flat, everything was easy breezy, but when I joined in the round, my tension changed so much that I just couldn't make it work. And as a result, I just avoid any patterns that have me alternate between knitting slip stitches flat and knitting them in the round. And I think the only place where I could see myself using this kind of stitch pattern is for heels on socks. Oh, and I also misinformed you about this pattern last time, so it doesn't have bell sleeves or like flared out blousy sleeves. They're just really straight sleeves with minimal decreases here at the bottom. And they are also finished with the same folded stockinette edge as the body. And another thing that I kind of forgot to mention about this pattern is that I was able to get gauge, and I actually found this pattern through searching for the right gauge. This is recommended to be knit on 5 millimeters, but I'm using 3.75/4, so this is just a testament to how much of a loose knitter I am. But it also really depends, because I find that for some patterns I don't actually have to change my needle size too much or like decrease my needle size, but if the designer is a tight knitter, I have to like adjust so much, and it's just really freaky to me to knit this in a really different needle size that just feels different in your hands, but knowing that I have the same gauge as somebody who is using much larger needles. And I guess that's everything I wanted to say about this project so far, so please just wish me luck that I'm able to find the same dye lot, or at least a really minimally different dye lot to this, and I will probably show it to you finished next time you see me, because I'm going on a little weekend trip, and since this is just mindless stockinette at this point, I'm gonna take it with me, and I'm hoping to get it finished. And the last work in progress I have for you today is definitely my comfort knit, and I love it so much. I'm just in my happy place when I'm knitting this. And this is actually interesting because this is a hybrid of two patterns. So Mysa Shawl pattern from Andolini Knits. It's a free pattern for a very simple garter stitch shawl, and it has an applied I-cord edge, which I'm not really sure if I'm gonna add or not because I kind of like the edge I'm ending up with. And I'm also incorporating motifs from the Vyshyvanka shawl by Olga Putano. It's from her book Field Notes, which has so many beautiful patterns, but this one actually caught my eye a long time ago, and it has stockinette in between the sections of garter stitch in different color and slip stitch sections, but I really wanted the whole shawl to be in garter stitch for additional like squishiness and warmth. I really love it, but as a Ukrainian, I have to admit that to me, this motif doesn't really have a lot in common with the Vyshyvanka motifs I'm used to. And there is quite a specific reason why this particular knit is my comfort project, and it's because, well, not to get too gloomy, but with the summer ending, we're in for a really rough winter here in Ukraine. And of course, it's not going to be as bad in Lviv as in Kyiv, for example, or the eastern cities, but I expect to have many cold days without like either electricity or heating or, God forbid, water, because not having running water is the absolute worst, and it's not something I can fix with like a Blue Yeti or a power bank. So I'm kind of scared to see what's coming, and I'm just hoping that we can get through it smoothly. But my sort of silly way of coping with this and make myself feel better about colder days approaching is to start planning and knitting some cozy, simple things to keep me warm around the house and maybe make something for my boyfriend or my friends in Kyiv. And I'm hoping that this shawl will be really squishy, really useful to have on like super cold days, and I'm planning for it to be bigger than both patterns intend. Although I have at this point like a dozen small scarves and a couple of small triangular shawls, I still don't actually have a big cozy one, so I'm hoping this one will be my first. There is another one I'm working on called the Jacobi shawl, but it's kind of in hibernation and I need to get back into it by like reminding myself of the pattern repeat and seeing where exactly I am in terms of instructions. But this one is so simple, so mindless, and I don't actually look at the pattern. I just use the Vyshyvanka sample picture as my reference and kind of like count the rows. And these slip stitch motifs are super simple to knit as well. So it's really close to the pattern in terms of like stitch count and row count, but I am actually switching all of the stockinette bits to garter stitch, and I'm only leaving slip stitches here to make the slip stitch motif work, but otherwise it's just squishy garter stitch. And for my main color, I'm using one of my favorite, like all-time favorite yarns, and it's Semilla Melange from BC Garn. I know we need to like move on as a society from me raving about Loch Lomond and Semilla Melange, but I still was not able to find any yarn that I like better than this in terms of like being rustic but super squishy and soft at the same time. It is still a little bit matte and dry, but in a good way, and not, for example, as dry as knitting for Olive Heavy Merino, which I don't think I'll ever use. It's like one popular yarn that is not appealing to me no matter how many times I like touched it in the store or saw beautiful projects made from it. It's just not for me, but this is completely different. It's so pleasant to work with, and it also wears really well. And I have two skeins of this, so I'm almost done with the first one. I have like half a skein left, and as you can see, it's in a ball because unfortunately my ball winder broke and I don't know exactly how to fix it because I tried to like reassemble it, but it just gives me a lot of like barf at the top. So I think I'm just gonna have to buy myself a new ball winder because the one I have is like at least 5 years old. But anyway, my first contrast color is this green combo. So this is Mondim in a shade which I don't remember. It's probably a numbered shade and not a colorway name, and Rowan Kitzel Case in a shade which I also don't remember the name of. So I'm gonna put both of the names on the screen, and this combo is really nice because this yarn is a little bit lighter than the silk mohair, so the silk mohair kind of wraps around it and creates this like almost blown effect. But I unfortunately don't have enough of these to use it as a standalone contrast color because this is actually leftover from a pair of socks. It's like 25 grams in here, which is about 100 meters. So if I have the intention to make the shawl even bigger than the original pattern, I don't think I can get away with 100 meters. So I decided to add another contrast color to the mix. And I have tried multiple different options. So anything from like periwinkle blue to red or yellow. I tried to add this Alvor yarn from Rosarios, but nothing really clicked for me because the only color I really liked with this green was actually this brick color, but I have a tiny little sample skein and I can't get any more of this yarn. This is actually a really similar shade to the contrast color used in the Vyshyvanka sample, but it's a different yarn. So this is Suni from Amano, and I got 3 different little sample skeins at HH Cologne, and I still have not found any use for them because I don't want to unwrap them for nothing. But regardless, I kind of lamented not having more of this, and I'm still really determined to not buy any more yarn unless I really have to. So my last option before giving up and making a smaller version of this shawl was to try my trusted cacao shade from Cardiff Cashmere. It's of course Cardiff Cashmere Classic, and I've used this brown as a contrast color before in my Ieva shawl. I was saving it for a pair of penny gloves, for example, but alas, it's not gonna happen because it suits this color combo so perfectly, and I'm so glad that I decided to add it here. Super happy with this color scheme, and my only concern was that the Cardiff Cashmere would be too thin compared to this yarn, which is much more like filled in and squishy, and of course this combo, which is fingering plus silk mohair, but it's fluffy enough, plus it's dark, so you can't really see any gaps in between the stitches. It will fluffen up even more after blocking, so I'm not worried. When I'm not knitting this, I actually miss it, so I'm really looking forward to getting back into it once I'm done recording. And I can already tell that once it's finished, it's going to be such a comforting, soft, warm accessory to have. And I also found it to be a lot of fun combining patterns, so I think it's something I will explore more in the future because, for example, there are a couple of designs that I really like which have saddle shoulders, and I am not a fan of saddle shoulders. I much prefer mock saddle shoulders, so I think it's going to be fun and like an interesting challenge to try and rework a saddle shoulder pattern into mock saddle shoulders. So I guess that's everything I wanted to talk about, and I don't have any acquisitions this time, which makes me very happy, and I think I will see you very soon because, as you can see, I'm really in the zone with my projects, and I also have more in my like queue and hibernation that I will pick up once these ones are finished. And if you like this episode, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more. I would really love to see you here again, and if you want to support my channel directly, I have my PayPal linked in the description, so you can buy me a cup of coffee if you want to. I also have a really lukewarm announcement, and it's that I have made a Ravelry group, and for now it's blank, and I don't know exactly what is my plan with this knitting group. My ideal plan is to have some like discussion boards for us to talk about our current projects and maybe ask questions, maybe have some like project showcase, and I think it's going to be really fun once it's more settled. So if you want to join, I will link it below, and if you have any suggestions or ideas or maybe experience with Ravelry groups, please let me know either here in the comments or on Instagram or via email. I would be so happy to hear from you. As always, I wish you happy knitting and a wonderful day ahead, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!